page 144, beginning of chapter 8. We're going to skip right through chapter 8 today. Start it today, finish it today. Remember the assignment. You didn't have to read it, just skim through it. So we're going to do the same thing today. We're going to go very quickly. Look at the title. Establishment of the new government. We spent all that time on the Constitution. All right, weeks. Well, guess what? So did they, our founding fathers. They spent all that time writing the Constitution, making a better government than the Articles of Confederation. Remember, they wrote it in 1787, then they ratified it, approved it. Well, now it's time to, look at the title of the chapter, establish our new government. In other words, start using the Constitution. So in 1788, remember, written in 1787, so the next year, 1788, it kicks in, we start using it. We elected a Congress, we elected a president, the very first president, which of course was George Washington. Not only is he a great general, remembered as a great leader and father of our country, but he was, of course, the very first president. He won the election in 1788. But he didn't become president until he was inaugurated in 1789. You understand that, right? We still did it that way, right? We have elections in November, and then the following year, we do our inauguration after the first of the year. So here's a famous painting of the first presidential inauguration. We know the who, all right? That's George Washington. I got a couple questions. What's the when? What's the date? When did this event take place? Riley?
1789?
It did in 1789, but more specific, what date? Christian?
April 30th.
April 30th, 1789. Nowadays, of course, we have our inauguration on January 20th, but in those days it took a little longer, so this event takes place April 30th, 1789. Very first inauguration. Now we know the who and when, where. Where is this taking place? Neela?
Federal Hall,
Federal Hall in what city?
New York.
It's in New York City. Not in Washington, D.C., because there is no such thing as Washington, D.C., not yet. Right? It's still a wilderness. In fact, President Washington will oversee the planning of our new capital city. So in the meantime, we chose one of our prominent cities, New York City, to be our temporary capital. So here it is, the very first oath of office taken by George Washington, Federal Hall, New York City, April 30th, 1789. By the way, Federal Hall is still there. The entire city has changed around it, but that building is still there. The same location, the corner of Wall and Broad Streets in downtown Manhattan, New York City. Right across the street from the New York Stock Exchange. In fact, you'll today see a statue of George Washington at the front of the building, because that's where he took his first oath of office. George Washington set a couple of traditions that day. Pretty cool traditions that we still follow now. And it's really cool because even though we constantly emphasize that we are a nation of laws, we also have some pretty interesting traditions. Not written down as laws, just American traditions. George Washington started a couple of them that day. One is he placed his hand on a Bible during the oath, and the other one, he ended the oath with 4 words that do not appear in the Constitution. What were those 4 words? Chrissy?
So help me God.
So help me God. And every single president, from George Washington to Donald Trump, has followed that tradition. They've had every oath of office, their hand on a Bible, and ended with the word, so help me God, even though not necessarily required by law. Just a really cool American tradition. So here is a short video, 5-minute video of that first oath of office, April 30th, 1789, Federal Hall, New York City. Pretty good video. This gentleman is vice president. Who was our first vice president? Hannah? John Adams from Massachusetts. Alright, and he's here talking to other leaders. Washington hasn't arrived yet. And he's babbling on, and they're bored to death because nobody ever cares about the vice president, right? He even makes that comment. He says, as vice president, I'm nothing, but I could be everything. Right, if the president were to die, and every single vice president since has had that same feeling. So he's gonna babble here, and then when Washington walks in, you'll see they're not bored anymore.
That's either dangerous to my reputation or disproportionate to my talents. It would have been inconsistent to have adopted a different maxim of conduct at this time. And yet, I feel a great difficulty as to how to act. I am vice president, yes, and in this I am nothing. But I may be everything. Well, Jim, you are here.
I am Mr. Adams.
Not sure what to do next. We've never done this before, right? It's the first time.
Yes, we are ready to administer the oath of office, sir.
I am at your service.
It's like a Trump rally.
General, if you would please place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand. Repeat after me. I, George Washington, do solemnly swear
George Washington. Do solemnly swear.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
Of the United States.
and will, to the best of my ability,
To the best of my ability.
preserve, protect, and defend
Serve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
It is done. God bless George Washington, President of the United States!
And then they started playing YMCA, and everybody in the crowd was going. No, that's just Trump rally. This was actually an inauguration ceremony, so we're different. Riley,
Were they holding the wrong flag?
were they what?
Holding the wrong flag?
What do you mean by wrong flag?
Because it looked like they were holding the American flag of what it would be today, not the 13 colonies flag.
No, I didn't notice that. That would be a dumb error for the movie maker, wouldn't it?
It looked kind of like it.
I don't know, I'd have to look back at that. That was, from a series that HBO did several years ago called That John Adams, about his life actually.
Why did he kiss the Bible?
I don't know, guess out of his love and respect for God's word. He didn't want to say, it is impossible to rightly govern without God in the Bible. At first, there was some confusion of what to call our chief executive. Right? There were different ideas about your highest honor, your excellency, whatever, but they all sounded kind of royal, and we didn't want anything to do with that. So we finally settled on president, and then there was a question of how to address that person. And George Washington cleared that up. He said, simply refer to me as Mr. President. So to this day, that's still what we do. No, you will never hear anyone call President Trump Mr. Trump. That would be very disrespectful. In fact, when a president is introduced, when you're speaking to a president, you wouldn't call him even then President Trump. If you're speaking about him, you can call him President Trump. If you're speaking to him, you would simply say Mr. President. The point is, the person doesn't matter. It's all about the office. So you'll hear oftentimes when presidents are introduced in public, it's proper to say, ladies and gentlemen, the President Donald Trump. That's fine, but the most appropriate way is, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. We don't need a name, that's not the point. The point is, it's all about the office, and we as Americans, we need to respect the office of the presidency. You don't need to respect the person who holds that office, that's up to you to decide. But as an American, you must respect the office, because to disrespect the president is basically to disrespect the people of America. Because it's we the people who choose him. There's never been a president who puts themselves in that position through money or power or royalty or family name. They're chosen by we the people. So whoever holds that office, it's up to us to respect the office itself, because to not do that would be disrespecting the people of America. Look on page 146. We know the first vice president was John Adams. Here are two members pictured on page 146 of the two members of the first cabinet. Right? The cabinet is a word that means the president's advisors. They are people chosen by the president himself to give him advice when he needs to make big decisions. Think about it. Presidents are generally going to be very impressive and accomplished people, right? They're president. Excuse me, they might be an expert on something. Some have been experts on the military. We've had generals as president, George Washington, General Grant, General Eisenhower, there have been others. Some presidents might be experts on foreign affairs. Thomas Jefferson, Richard Nixon was known for that. Some presidents might be an expert on the economy. It's one of the things that got Donald Trump elected, because he was not a politician, he was a lifelong businessman. And knew how to build things and create jobs, and he understood how the economy works. So they might be an expert on something, but there's no one anywhere who's an expert on everything, right? And the president has to make decisions on a wide variety of issues. So he surrounds himself with advisors, and we call those people the cabinet. And they head up the different cabinet departments. I think there are 17 of them now. There were 4 under Washington, and there are 2 of them. You'll see Alexander Hamilton. He was the very first Secretary of the Treasury, heading up the Treasury Department. And even today, Hamilton is on the $10 bill. On the backside of the $10 bill is the Treasury building, since he was the first Secretary of the Treasury. Our first Secretary of State heading up the State Department was Thomas Jefferson. The Secretary of State deals with foreign affairs issues. In other words, relationships with other countries. As you know, we're not the only country in the world, and we need to have friendly relationships with other countries. That's the responsibility to keep those relationships good. That goes to the Secretary of State. So they travel a lot, they talk to the leaders of other countries, and it's kind of a known thing around the world. When you're talking to the Secretary of State, it's just like you're talking to our president, because he's on the cabinet. Well, what you need to know about Hamilton and Jefferson, the two guys on page 146, they didn't get along. They disagreed on every single issue of the day. Everything. They disagreed where to eat lunch every day. I mean, they disagree on everything. There's only one thing they agreed on, and they both had great respect for George Washington. Other than that, they're disagreeing on every issue. And that is one of the reasons Washington chose them. See, not only was Washington the father of our country, a great general, great character, he's also a wise leader. Imagine if you were president and everyone on your cabinet had the exact same viewpoint on all the issues. What good would that be? Right? You're always going to get a one-sided advice. Washington, as a wise leader, understood that he wanted to hear different perspectives. And then the final decision is always up to the president. So if he would listen to advice, like all presidents do, from his cabinet, and then the president has to make the final decision. So if decisions don't work out, presidents cannot blame their cabinet for two reasons. Cabinet doesn't make decisions, presidents do. And the second reason is the president chose the cabinet. He chose those people to give him advice. Well, like I said, Washington wanted differing viewpoints, so he would listen to Hamilton, listen to Jefferson, and then he would make the final decision. He was a wise leader. All right, let's flip up to page 152. Washington's farewell. Washington served 2 terms as president, elected in 1788, re-elected to a second term in 1792. He could have run again in 1796. In fact, everybody wanted him to. He was so admired and respected. Had he run again, he would have won. No doubt about it. Washington is often referred to as the man who could have been king. What we mean by that is because he was so well liked and respected, he could have been president until he died. But he understood the separation of powers, that if he would be president for more than 8 years, that would give too much power to the executive branch, one person, the president. So he stepped aside. Again, one of those examples, one of those traditions George Washington started that every single president followed until FDR, and then shortly after that we amended the Constitution. So now all they're all limited to 2 terms. So after his second term, one of the things he did is he gave the American people a farewell address. Father of our country. So our father gave us some advice for the future of America. Let's see how well we did following the advice. One of the things he warned us about is becoming too divided. Don't focus on the things that we see differently. To focus more on the things that unite us as Americans. Did we listen to that advice? No, in fact, we got to the point where we were so divided we had a civil war. And nowadays, in my long time in this country, I've told you before, I think this is the most divided we have ever been. That's sad. We should have listened to his advice. We should focus more on the things that unite us as Americans, but instead we focus on the things we disagree on. There's always gonna be disagreements. He also warned us against having lasting ties with foreign countries, entangling alliances with other countries. Now, there's treaties, we know what a treaty is, it's a written agreement between two countries, that's fine, we're gonna need to enter into treaties, but he warned against long-lasting, entangling agreements or alliances with other countries. Because he was afraid that then someday we would be making decisions that were against the best interests of our country. And I'm afraid we didn't listen to that advice either. He also warned us to stay out of debt. Did we listen to that one? No. He understood that sometimes the government's gonna have to borrow money to pay its bills, but then to pay that money back, just like our families do from time to time. But he warned against a large, massive debt, and now we have tens of trillions with no idea how we're gonna pay it back. Should've listened to our father's advice. Anyway, after his presidency, he retired to his home. This is a picture of his house. It's Mount Vernon, Virginia. It's on the banks of the Potomac River. You can see on the other side of the house. The other side of the river is Maryland. The Potomac River is the boundary between Virginia and Maryland. Right down the river is Washington, D.C. Remember, George Washington never lived there. He's the only president to never live in Washington. But he did oversee the planning and the building of the city. When it was time to name it, he did not want it to be named after him. He was also a very humble man, but Congress outvoted him on that one. He's also the only president to have a state named after him, Washington State. Mount Vernon's a tourist place now, you can visit. You can go inside the house, it's been refurbished so that there's, even today, a lot of the furniture, some of the items in there are original, they were actually owned by George Washington. But the whole house has been refurbished, the whole property, the whole farm, the big plantation has been kind of refurbished so that it's exactly the way it was when George Washington lived there. So where, if you go there where you see a vegetable garden or an herb garden or a flower garden or a fruit orchard or where the livestock lives, that's all the same way it was when George Washington lived there, the same spot on the plantation. The rooms in the house are painted the exact same colors that they were when George Washington lived there. And we know all those things because he kept meticulous records. We have volumes and volumes of things in his handwriting. He was so organized, we know exactly how his home and his whole farm was organized. So we recreated it. So it's kind of like that. When you visit it, it's like you were there when he was there. He finally died, was buried at Mount Vernon. Congress wanted to bury him in Washington, D.C. In fact, when they built the Capitol building, in the basement they built a crypt to bury the father of our country, but in his will, he wanted to be buried at his home at Mount Vernon, so we of course followed his wishes, and his tomb is on Mount Vernon, not too far of a walk from that house. You can see his tomb in there. He's with his wife and other family members. He died not long after being president. He died in December of 1799. So just a couple of years after his presidency ended, and he died by being bled to death by his own doctor. See, in those days they would do what we call bloodletting. We're always learning, right, about the human body and medicine and how to treat different things. Well, by 1799 we had learned a lot, but there was still a lot to learn. Even nowadays, we're still learning, figuring out how to treat different things. But we know a lot more than we did in 1799, obviously. Well, what they knew was that in some diseases, the bacteria or the viruses are carried by the blood. That's true. So they figured that if someone's feeling sick, they could cut an artery and let some of that blood out. Let some of that disease out. Yeah, well, there's a problem with that. There's also life in the blood, right? And apparently his doctors let too much of the blood out, and they bled him to death. Real good doctor, huh? However, we can't give him too hard of a time because they didn't know what we know now. In fact, if you've ever seen those signs outside an old-fashioned barber shop, those poles with red and white diagonal stripes on it, the red represents blood, the white represents bandages. Back in the day, if you were feeling sick, you could go visit a barber shop and get more than a haircut and a shave. They sit you in the chair, they got the razor and everything ready to go. They slice an artery, let a little blood out, and then patch you up, send you on your way. I like to get my hair cut at an old-fashioned barber shop. I went last week, but I just got the standard haircut. I didn't have any other medical treatment. They don't actually do that anymore, but that's what those red and white stripes represent on the barber's pole. Yes.
How they let the blood out of George Washington, they did that. It wasn't like he had like a cold or the flu, but he was older, so that's why that happened. And they tried doing that, like it like sort of worked, but then the night, like, didn't he die in the middle of the night? Yeah, it was like, yeah.
Yep. So, bad doctoring. So once he died, of course, the nation mourned. They held his funeral. The eulogy was given at his funeral. That's the person that's going to give a big speech, say nice things about you. That's what happens at a funeral, right? They say nice things about the dead person, which has always kind of bothered me. I'm sure you've been to funerals. I've been to a lot of funerals. And your whole life, you just hear people, they criticize you, tell you what you're doing wrong. There's one day where all anybody says is nice things about you. That's at your funeral, and you're not even there to hear it. Ain't that a shame? So I wish I could go to my own funeral. Well, I'm not sure how to figure out how to do that. But it'd be nice to hear all people say nice things about me for a change, huh? Also, I live by this rule of thumb. If you don't go to other people's funerals, they won't go to yours. So remember that.
Oh.
Whatever. At George Washington's funeral, the eulogy was given by a man named Richard Henry Lee, an ancestor of the man our county's named after. And he was a fellow Virginian, and he gave this famous line that we remember in history about George Washington. He was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Buried, of course, at Mount Vernon. So anyway, he was our first president. Our second president, the election of 1796. Remember, George Washington elected in 1788, 1792, steps aside, so 1796. This is a crazy election because it's between the Vice President, John Adams, and the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, are running against each other. Now, remember what I told you, how Jefferson and Hamilton disagreed on everything? Well, guess what? Adams and Hamilton agreed on everything. So what does that mean? Jefferson and Adams disagreed on everything. They were political opponents. So they're running against each other for president. That's not that surprising, right? I mean, Trump and Biden disagree on all the issues, right? That's why they're running against each other. That's what an election's about. So that part's not crazy. Here's the crazy part. John Adams wins, gets the majority of the electoral votes, so he becomes our second president. But second place in the electoral votes was Thomas Jefferson, so he became vice president. President Adams, Vice President Jefferson, and remember, they disagree on everything. That would be like President Trump and Vice President Biden. I don't think that would work too well. They don't like each other. They disagree on everything. Well, guess what? They didn't like each other. They disagreed on everything. And one was president, vice president. That would have been a weird 4 years, huh? Well, let's see, flip pages, go up to page 158, the election of 1800. It's a rematch. They're running against each other again. Now, how crazy is this? It's President Adams running against his own Vice President Jefferson. That's crazy. I don't think we'll ever see that again, do you? This time, Jefferson wins. So Jefferson's our third president. But Adams is not vice president. Remember the 12th Amendment, we changed how we do that. But anyway, now it's our third president, Thomas Jefferson. Adams served just one term. Jefferson is gonna serve two. We'll talk about his 2 terms as president in later lessons. So anyway, these 2 guys disagreed, not just while they were running against each other, but long after they were both done being president. Long after they both retired from politics and went back home. John Adams went back to Massachusetts. Thomas Jefferson went back to Monticello, his home in Virginia, and for the rest of their life, they wrote letters to each other, arguing about all the issues of the day. They just couldn't stop. Lifelong political opponents. In fact, they had a little contest going. They were each determined to outlive the other and be the winner and live longer than their lifelong political opponent. Which leads us to one of the craziest, you can't make this up stories about American history. Lifelong political opponents. Finally, one day, Thomas Jefferson dies. But the day happens to be July 4th. Our country was born on July 4th, right? With the Declaration of Independence, who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Thomas Jefferson. So the primary author of the Declaration of Independence dies on the 4th of July. You can't make that up, right? That's a crazy story. But it gets crazier. The year he died was 1826. What year was our country born on the 4th of July? 1776, right? So exactly 50 years later. Not just the anniversary of the birth of our country, but the Jubilee year, the 50th anniversary. The guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence dies. Well, the story gets crazier. John Adams died the same day, later in the day. He was one of the 5 guys, these were 2 of the 5 guys on that committee to write the Declaration of Independence. They both signed it on the 4th of July, 50 years before the day they both died.
He died on the
How can you make this up? Lifelong political opponents trying to outlive each other. Jefferson died in the morning, Adams later that day. Adams' last words were, "Jefferson outlives me." He thought he lost. He actually won, but he didn't have word yet that Jefferson had died, so he didn't get to enjoy his victory, as short as it was. Whatever. Crazy. One of the crazy coincidences of American history, you couldn't make it up. Lifelong political opponents determined to outlive each other die on the same day. Happens to be the 50th anniversary of the birth of our country, and the 2 of them were instrumental in the Declaration of Independence. Crazy, but true story.